As always, I bid you benum Christine, greet Christ in you, and welcome you back this morning. Today we're going to be looking at this question of the inner Herod, a sort of aspect of what I talk about in the book that we'll explore under sort of a different context in the next chapter, looking at Christian asceticism, but this hints a little bit toward it because it's Herod who, as we've been talking about in the previous few paragraphs in Matthew's birth narrative, it's Herod who, in seeking really to eliminate the threat of Christ's birth in his kingdom, sort of very subtly and sneakily attempts to assassinate him, and in doing so ends up slaughtering many small children, as Matthew tells the story. We've looked at issues around whether or not that story is historical or theological, reflecting, as we see Matthew tries to do, reflecting the life of Moses in the life of Jesus. And of course, Moses himself almost met his end by the king of his day, Pharaoh, who for different reasons went after all the male children, 2 years and younger, as a way of eliminating the threat of a growing slave population of the Hebrews in his country of Egypt. So whether or not the story of Herod that we're exploring is historical or a theological reinterpretation of the life of Moses is debated, and for our purposes, I think matters little. What we'll be doing is looking at the way in which that influence of Herod continues to operate potentially within our own hearts, and how we can begin to recognize that as a kind of a force within us, or resistance within us against that birthing of Christ. And that brings us to our paragraphs for today. So let us pray. So God to enfold me, God to surround me, God in my speaking, God in my thinking, God in my sleeping, God in my waking, God in my watching, God in my hoping, God in my life, God in my lips, God in my soul, God in my heart, God in my sufficing, God in my slumber, God in mine ever-living soul, God in mine eternity. Amen. So the paragraphs we'll be looking at today, both are on page 90 out of chapter 3 of the book, for those of you following along. So aside from questions of historicity, the hostility of these worldly kings betrays something universal about the inner life of contemplation. And of course, here I'm talking about the worldly kings of Pharaoh and Herod. It is the nature of the false self and its projected ego in the world to rail, like Herod, against the daily birth of Christ within us. No less in Pharaoh do we encounter the devastating consequences of the false self in action, unmasking the human ego as its weapon of choice. The actions of both kings serve as a reminder that the enemy we face in the false self is not merely a nuisance or spiritual inconvenience. It is not just that aspect of myself I experience as petty, negative, or self-interested, but rather it lies at the root of history's most unfathomable displays of cruelty and brutality. As we will explore in the following chapter, these are our demons, and they are the enemy of the spiritual life, through which the moral atrocities of the world are conceived and executed. They personify that place of darkness in the human heart that Christ insists makes a person unclean. So let us pray. So, amen. So our second reading today also comes from page 90. So Herod represents a devastating indictment of humanity's capacity for darkness. But attempting to veil this fact from our spiritual and ethical consciousness too easily leads to a dangerous complacency. A spiritual truth to which our culture and society have so successfully numbed us is that the contemplative life is not a luxury or a quaint pastime, but a matter of grave spiritual, social, and now even planetary urgency. Contemplatives know this intuitively. The prayer of silence that confronts the tyranny of the false self and opens us to the transforming power of the Spirit is a moral imperative. So we'll close with a prayer and then open the time for discussion. The compassing of God beyond thee, the compassing of the God of life, the compassing of Christ beyond thee, the compassing of the Christ of love, the compassing of Spirit beyond thee, the compassing of the Spirit of grace, the compassing of the three beyond thee, the compassing of the three preserve thee, the compassing of the three preserve thee. Amen. Right. So as always, I open the floor to any comments that you have or questions about the reading that we explored today. Hi, Richard. Good morning.
Good morning, Father Vincent. Good morning, all. 3 parts. The devastating recognition that Herod and me may even be the cause of my wanting to appear as a spiritual mystic, to cover the whole of me. I was moved before this session reading Robert Layler's post about Francis' all-night prayer. Who am I, God, and who are you? The mystery of God setting me up as an angel, as a spiritual being with demons. I recorded Rollo May in the 1980s, a brilliant psychologist who said, we have to wrestle with our demons. And this is the most serious work of our life, that we have to wrestle with our demons. And from that comes us. So it's not like I'm this good guy and others are bad. It's that what's in me causes the horror in this life and the beauty. Second, I'm grateful for this time together that Robert and others set up so that Father Vincent can invite us to open our hearts. And I wonder if there's a funding mechanism so that all are served in this. On Father's Day, I remember my own father, who didn't pretend to be a mystic, though he had his depth. And he didn't pretend. So now I have to face in me, what part of my claimed spiritual mysticism is pretense. Thank you.
Richard, thanks. That's very honest and forthright. And I think it raises the question for all of us. As this particular community makes our way very slowly through contemplating Christ, I'm aware that the next chapter, which today's readings anticipate, really are going to look at this question in a sustained way. What does it mean to grapple with demons, which is essentially what is the life of Christian asceticism, and what value does that have for the modern Christian? And I do attempt to reframe that in a way that gets beyond morbidity and excesses and sort of body-hating approaches that I think is really a misunderstanding of what asceticism is about. So I'm trying to reframe it in terms of what I think is authentic about it, but also in a way that we as modern Christians could really make sense of it. One of the, I guess, concerns I have about that with the way that we're moving through the book, which is to say very slowly, is that, moving through an entire chapter that grapples with wrestling with demons, doing only 2 paragraphs per week, could feel wearisome after a time, because it's really going to prolong that conversation. But, one of the things that I want to stress is when we look at the ancient mothers and fathers of the Christian desert. I just gave a little retreat this past week on Celtic Christian spirituality, which is, some of you may have recognized, my prayers came out of that tradition today. It's been on my mind. But, for these Christians who really understood asceticism in the life of this, the spiritual woman or man, in many ways, just the way our prayer is grappling with distraction, that is the stuff of what we're doing. We're noticing and putting aside, noticing and putting aside. That is meditation. That is essentially what we're doing. That practice of asceticism, which is the exteriorization of that interior process, was the stuff of the spiritual life. It's what they did in the desert. Their lives were completely dedicated to ascetical practices. And that, again, is not morbid, body-hating practices, but practices that help them see their inner Herods, see those demons, recognize them, battle with them, to be freed from them. And so it was a life of movement towards spiritual freedom. And it took just a tremendous amount of candid honesty, like what you just shared, Richard, about how we might hide behind labels or pretense or projected identities. And it was about unmasking those, not as a way of inducing shame or a sense of guilt, but in God's mercy to be free of the subtle hold that they have on us. And so I just want to sort of anticipate, as we're going to soon be moving into that next chapter, that what may seem to the modern contemplative as a particularly protracted attention to this, to realize this really is and has been the stuff of contemplative practice for Christian contemplatives, and frankly, I think contemplatives of most all traditions, and is therefore intended to be a liberating, freeing realization, rather than one that just becomes overly obsessive around our failings or shortcomings or shadow side. So I'll be trying to walk us through that very gently, but also with the kind of authenticity that you brought to it, Richard. So thank you for your comments this morning. Let's see. I think Luke, that brings you next. Yeah, Luke, you're on, please.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I've been sort of contemplating this a bit this week, and it was kind of it was interesting, Father Vincent, that you made that reference to seeing our inner Herod just now, because that has certainly been, when I look, I mean, there certainly is, you know, a variety of Herods that exist within me, and and certainly in the past, when I look back on kind of my life so far, sort of I can see that, you know, it's been, by and large, it's been my obliviousness to what was really going on inside of myself that has been the source of most of the sort of destructive behaviors and comportments in relationships, and unfortunately, certainly in my case, the pattern has generally been that it seems to be like 2 or 3 years after the fact, I kind of look back, and with this sort of realization of, oh, now, okay, now I understand why I was being so petty with my then partner, you know. So I'm hoping I can narrow that gap. But the other thing that at a more sort of external level in thinking about this story, that really struck me, and looking at my own life and my sort of my role in the world, I guess, is you know, the fact that it's not just Herod, I guess, that the instrument of the evil isn't just Herod, it's all of the people who implemented Herod's orders. I mean, that's what sort of, who went along with it. And I recently watched the movie A Hidden Life, which is about Christian conscientious objectors in Christian conscientious objector in Nazi Germany. And while it's far less dramatic, it really made me think about all of the little ways I participate in and acquiesce to evil in the world, you know, whether it's taking unnecessary plane flights.
That movie called, The Hidden Something?
A Hidden Life, and or shopping on Amazon, which some, you know, there are issues, I believe, there, and things like that, you know, that there are many little ways where, because it's inconvenient to take the choice, that to adopt the choice that is more, that coheres with the way I want to live, laziness makes me complicit in evil. So I hope that didn't sound too dramatic, but that's what I've been thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Luke. And Kathy, I'm sorry I accidentally muted you there. Did you want to ask Luke something directly, or was there a question you had?
No, it was the name of the movie, but then he immediately said it right after I was saying it out loud.
Oh, okay. Okay, I think he interpreted you as having asked him. That's why. Yeah. Okay. No worries.
Okay.
So Luke, you know, in response then, you know, to this, I just want to, you know, sort of affirm what you're saying, you know, to anticipate how I'm going to develop this in chapter 4. And I suppose it's okay to do this because it'll bear repeating. You know, I try to dissect the kinds of so-called demons we deal with. And I look at what I call basically renegades, which are those overt sort of wild teenager impulses in us that can tend towards self-destruction. But then there's those I call the parasites, which are those that learn to live within us unnoticed, but very comfortably. And it's those that I really want to point out are the most dangerous, precisely because they lead to exactly what you're talking about, just a kind of lukewarm complacency that allows evil to go unnamed, unaddressed, unabated, and we just move on. And so while I think, you know, as I'll talk about, the renegades, I think, are born of places of brokenness, where we end up, you know, drinking to excess to because of maybe pain or trauma, or move into drug addiction, or these types of things are born of brokenness. that I think the parasites are born of complacency. And that's what makes them so dangerous. We don't want our life to be upset. It keeps us very lukewarm and very complacent. And we do the kinds of things in various ways that Richard was talking about, subtle gestures, symbolic gestures that make us feel okay, that make us feel good, but it's really not getting to the root of the problem. And so you speak for me, and I think for many of us in your own articulation of how these things present. And again, this isn't to sound, depressing or defeating. It's because when we begin to see how these subtle energies or forces or Herods or demons work in us, that's the first moment toward understanding how to be free of them. And then comes the battle, right? Because now you're exposing them for what they are. And I think that, one of the things I'll really talk about that's central here, and I hope you hear all of you hear as a very uplifting and positive kind of insight, is some of you may know that the word asceticism is closely linked in terms of its etymology, its origins, to the word athleticism. And so, asceticism is to the spiritual life what athleticism is to the physical life. It involves training toward a kind of perfection and a skill that you hone. But a major difference is that for the athlete, the goal is to succeed, to be superior, to be the best swimmer, the best runner, the fastest, whatever. The goal of the ascetic is to fail. And that's what we have to understand. And what I mean by that is, if asceticism in the Christian spiritual life becomes obsessed around the idea of succeeding, what we've done is simply reinvented a new form of Pharisaism, whereby I give in to the subtle suggestion that I have to prove myself worthy before God. And what I think is really at play here is we try until we realize we really are incapable of perfecting ourselves. And in those moments, we can truly, fall on our knees and say, I can't, you must. And then that becomes the moment in which we truly begin to give ourselves over to the action of grace, to the action of Christ or love, divine energy within us. And it's in that I think we begin to really move beyond. But you almost have to experience it firsthand, the trying and failing to really get that. It's like, as much as your parents tried to teach you, to spare you the terrors of growing up and the heartache and the pain, you don't really get it until you've been through it. And you have to learn through experience. So I just want to put that out there, that asceticism should not be conceived of as me spending my life trying to prove myself worthy or lovable. It's really teaching us that we are incapable of perfecting ourselves. That's just the human nature. That's our brokenness. It's the world we live in. We're sometimes complicit. We have to make choices that are not black and white. And then in that, we realize, but grace abounds. As Paul would say, where sin abounded, grace abounded all the more. And there's just a beautiful, liberating, I think, growth that comes out of that, but it takes us time to get there. So yeah, I hope that helps, Luke. But I thank you both, Richard and Luke, for really sharing. You could have just as well spoken my own heart, and I think the hearts of many of us, which is the beauty, by the way, of community, for us to be able to acknowledge this vulnerably and intimately, and not put on airs that we're better or we've got this nabbed or nailed down. Real spiritual community means we pour our hearts out and people say, yeah, me too. And I'm not going to try to hide that from you or pretend to be morally superior. And that's when I think community begins to be what it needs to be, that place where we're held in growth. Right. So thank you both for your witness to that. Robert, I think you're next. I know your hand gets a little messy there. So go right ahead.
First of all, I want to thank you for giving us 2 paragraphs at a time, because I could not handle more than that. What you are giving me is transforming my life, and I need time, and I need to take it in small doses. Otherwise, I may miss it. One of the things that I have learned by being here is that being right, in inverted commas, takes me to the starting block and not the finishing line. And that is so important, because as I now start the race from perhaps a position that's justifiably right, I need to constantly, as I progress, contemplate Christ. As I resist Herod in myself and in others, am I doing this from a place of love, or am I doing it from a place that will encourage Herods in myself and others to grow? And what I'm learning is the importance of everything that I do. I come back and ask myself, honestly, genuinely, am I doing this from a place of love? And when I fail, as I do all the time, at least it's almost like a plane coming back on track. And these are the gifts that I get from you, and I get from this community. And I'm so grateful. So, 2 paragraphs at a time, please. More than enough for me.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you. I hope you feel that by the end of chapter 4 as well. But I so appreciate your saying that. That's I agree. There's so much that I get in the way in which this community reflects back the things that I've tried to articulate. So that it really enriches it for me as well. And if ever you want to understand or resonate with this sense of this human condition that you're all speaking to, if you just read Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 7, he just, there's a lot of things Paul writes that frankly irritates me to no end. I'm not boasting. Well, actually, Paul, you are boasting, and you're constantly saying you're not, but that's exactly what you're doing. Things like that. He just goes on. But in this particular case, he so articulates the human condition of his whole experience as a Pharisee, and a really heartfelt, right, honest to goodness, trying to live a life of righteousness, and just realizes he can't do it. And then comes to the conclusion, I can't, you must, and how liberating that moment is for him. And he just speaks so clearly about that inner struggle, and that in fact, what Christianity is not about taking up that struggle anew or in a new way, but letting go of it altogether and letting Christ essentially do the work within you. Absolutely beautiful. I would challenge all of you to read Romans 7 and see if there's not something in it that you really don't see, so speaking to your own life. It's just so clear to me, but very universal. So thank you, Robert. And I appreciate the affirmation of the 2 paragraphs at a time approach. God bless you. Okay, Christine, please.
Thank you. I'm currently in the process of reading the 3 volumes of Kenosis by Boris Moraviev. And I just wanted to share this with you because I had this incredible breakthrough when he wrote that the only true emotion really is love, and that every other emotion has its foundation in love, which means even negative emotions have at their very heart love. And in my own experience, I found that sitting with a negative emotion gets me to the place of the understanding that under that emotion is some desire for love, for unconditional love, either for myself or for another. And that understanding kind of dismantles the walls of fear that keep me from going to those negative emotions, so that now I can see them as like the burning bush that drew Moses' attention to this holy ground. Where one can have an encounter with the living God that reveals this deep, deep desire for unconditional love. And I just wanted to share this with you because it's such a hard thing, I think, in dealing with demons. If we see it as a fearful place, I think it should be a fearful place in the sense of awe, the opportunity to have a real encounter with the living God and have that desire for love given.
Right. Right. Thank you, Christine. Thank you so much. One of the images that I often hold out about, really the way that the Desert Mothers and Fathers talked about this was essentially a spiritual combat on some level, right? Spiritual battle. But, you know, one of the ways that it speaks to me is the contrast between the Western and sort of, if you want to say, martial arts forms of dealing with an opponent. And in the Western form, you confront, like in boxing, you're really resisting their energy, pushing against their energy. Where in martial arts, you take the energy of the opponent and you work with it and you throw it over your shoulder. So when they're coming at you, you don't resist by pushing back. You use the momentum to keep going, and you use that to kind of essentially pull them over. And there's something insightful about that martial art approach to, I think, what you're saying. It's an image that I heard many years ago described to me in this, how we conceive of the combat of these demons. And one is to work with the energy as a way of overcoming it, rather than merely that sort of direct resistance. Perhaps different demons require different strategies to overcome, but I so appreciate that sense of moving into it and peeling back what is at the core of it in terms of our desire to love. In fact, it's a very, very helpful way for me to think about it in my own life. It's beautiful. So thank you for that. Joanne is asking if I'm breaking up for people. Am I? No. Joanne, I think that might be your connection. Yeah, sorry about that. No, okay. Let's see. So Sylvia, hi.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I love the 2 paragraphs a week, so I'm another big fan. And the comments have just been so resonant and beautiful this morning. And I want to echo that movie, A Hidden Life, which I've tried to get you to watch now for about 2 or 3 years. Remember, I've sent you things about, talked to you about it. A Hidden Life, it's by Terrence Malick, Mallick, and it's one of the most beautiful films I've ever seen. It's exquisite, and the message, the life of the Christ emerging from the main character is just, which is a true story.
Is this the story of Maximilian Kolbe?
No, it's
No.
a hidden conscientious objector in Austria in the Nazi era. And the hidden life is that he exemplified Christ in every way, but no one ever heard of him. He was a farmer with a little family out in a village, but there he was, a hidden life, and yet the beauty and anyway, it's just exquisite. So this is my most cherished and most difficult topic, because this is the core of where my separation from God lies, is that those things, especially what we would call as intense as demons, this is the root separation. This is the base wound. And many years ago, I'm sure most people here have too, I read of Meister Eckhart's reframing demons as our most devoted and loyal angels that are devoted to us to provide us that pain of seeing the wound of our separation and not let it go until we finally are able to, or have the capacity to, be with those demons and sit down and say, teach me, I surrender to you, I want you, I am embracing you. And so for me, we've discussed this here before, and Richard has brought it up too, it's to evolve beyond fight, flight, freeze, to tend and befriend. So our millions of years of evolution have created the fight, flight, freeze scenario, which saved us when it was literally life or death. And now, as we are able to be contemplatives and have the community and the safety, because I believe that are most dangerous, as you pointed out just a moment ago, areas of our being are the hidden areas, are the numb, the frozen, the barricaded. And I also am, I completed a year-long course in personal and collective trauma, and there's a whole trauma, just psychological and spiritual movement going on to revisit trauma. And a film just came out called The Wisdom of Trauma, which I sent you a link to. And it is that when we have experienced such horrific wounds of separation from our true self, from God, that's where the trauma resides. And for many of us, me included, my wound was so core that I had to numb myself to it, that it was a kindness, a gentleness, a survival capacity that didn't let me experience the true wounded nature of the traumas that I had experienced in childhood. When you look at prisoners, and this is not to excuse any of their criminal behavior ever, not to excuse it, but 100% of them were horrifically abused as children and grew up in violent, terrifying circumstances, let's say 99.9%. And again, it's not to excuse, but it's that in dealing with our demons, we have to have an environment of love and safety. And first, there has to be that self-compassion, because otherwise they remain hidden. And it's the ones that show up that are letting us know, okay, I'm ready to meet you because I can see you, I can feel you, I can track you. And the ones that are hidden are staying hidden. But the more we grow and become awake in God, the more the demons show up, because the ones that are the most hidden now have space. So, I think sometime in my development, I've thought, well, gosh, I really looked at this and this and this, and why are more still showing up? Well, it's because those were the deepest ones, the ones that I was too overwhelmed by to be able to tend and befriend. So, and there's a Rilke poem where one of his lines is, our life is to be beaten by greater and greater angels. So the angels, we get to wrestle with the small ones, and then we open and bring the light of love and God. And the next one shows up, and then the next one. So
I think it's the case that when you're first beginning to look at this interior life, the larger, more obvious things are there, and it takes a while to clear that out of the way. But then you start seeing, as you're saying, the smaller or subtle things, which now become more apparent because the larger things that would draw your attention immediately have been sort of dealt with, or cast aside, or overcome, or whatever, reconciled. But then indeed, the more you continue to look, you just see these more subtle things that you wouldn't notice otherwise.
And the places where we don't look, they let us know subtly that they're there, and sometimes not so subtly, because they will continue to show up as symptoms in our life. Mm-hmm. And we wonder, why is this happening again? Why did I create this mess over here, or whatever? And then we move on to the next, but that's why Meister Eckhart, I think, called them our most devoted, loyal angels, pretending to be demons, just like, okay, you didn't get it yet, so I'm going to have to keep biting you. And then the symptom arises, it arises again and again. And then finally, the ultimate wound, which is, I am not worthy of God. I am not enough to be with God. I am too whatever it is to be with God. Those core, whatever our core wound is that keeps us separate. But love, as Robert said, I believe is the ultimate key to the kingdom.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, beautifully said, Sylvia. I appreciate that. Yeah, as we move into the next chapter, I think we'll see, how I try to address some of those things of becoming more aware of those energies, if you want to say. So thank you very much. Good. Other questions or thoughts before we move on to questions of practice? Anything about content? Hi, Mary. How you doing?
Good morning.
Morning.
Just to follow something about what Sylvia was saying, I also watched the movie and I also listened to all the profound speakers. And listening to the movie, The Wisdom of Trauma, gave me a clearer understanding of the false self and the essential self. And so when you spoke today about demons and Herod, I went right back to that movie and went right back to the understanding that because of trauma, we are separated from our essential self. And all of that separation gets played out as demons and Herod. So I had never gotten a really good understanding of what the false self was, but that's how it came to me. So I appreciated Sylvia's sharing about all of that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mary. Yeah, one of the analogies or images that's come to me recently, we are experiencing a terrible drought here right now in California, and no end in sight for at least 5 or 6 months before we can even hope for some rains to return. And so, we are, of course, doing our part to be as restrictive as possible with the use of water. We have a beautiful garden in the yard that on a normal year I would keep irrigated on a regular basis, but which I've shut down now. And we're doing that thing where you fill buckets with cold water when you take a shower so it doesn't go to waste. And I'm just very sparsely rationing this water onto my garden to keep it going. And one of the things I realized in this environment is how life-sucking weeds are, because there's not enough water to share with the weeds growing next to the plants that I'm trying to encourage and sustain. And the work of sort of removing those has become a little bit of a meditative practice around how do those energies within me, those Herods, those demons, take precious resources from my spiritual life, from my capacity to love, from my spiritual growth. How do those roots, and of course, the longer the weed is there, the deeper the roots, the larger the plant, the more energy and water it wants to consume. So I've started seeing kind of as a spiritual practice, well, what are the weeds that are drawing from this life-giving water in me, the water of the Spirit, if you want to use that analogy, and how do I start to remove those while they're still young and small, in order to divert all of that energy where I want it to go, which is into loving and into compassion and so on. So there's so many beautiful analogies I think we can think through around how we grapple with and learn from these energies within us, the shadow side, as we often call it. And I appreciate the reflections that I'm hearing today on all of that. Thank you. Hi, Marianne, go right ahead.
Good morning.
Morning.
First time here, and thank you. That was a beautiful reflection I needed. I'll reflect with that for, I think, many days this week. And I struggle with the nature of evil and calling things demons. And I think as I'm a 1 on the Enneagram, and as this fear, like, there's evil in me, seeing those imperfections that I want to grow with in the light of Christ and offer compassion. But I struggle with the whole thing of the evil in the world, and that evil is evil in there. I mean, we see the roots. I think we have to look at, but it's confusing to me, the evil in our hearts, and we see what awful evil is done in the world, and it's coming from our hearts. So I'm just trying to grapple with all that.
Yeah, well, you're in the right place, Marianne. First of all, welcome. I'm happy to have you here today. It's very nice, and I noticed a few newcomers today, and I'm grateful for your presence here. So welcome, one and all. Marianne, to your question, I think that whenever we're looking into the spiritual life or the life, the analogies and images and metaphors we draw from theologically, all of them to a degree walk with a limp, that none of them quite grasp, I think, the subtleties we're dealing with. And I think even in the sort of contributions you've heard this morning, whether we pluck, that evil from the roots out of our hearts or tend to them as angels trying to awaken us to where our wounds are, I don't think necessarily these are opposing images. I think they help give us different approaches to the same reality, which you've just named. There's evil in the world. What do we do with that? One of the things that I'll say, I think probably next week, depending on, but I know that the paragraph is coming up soon, is that while we can talk about an inner Herod, and of course, this whole book is looking at the interiority of Christ, of us becoming Christ in the world, how the incarnation, it continues to be enfleshed in us, that's really the message of Christianity ultimately. That we cannot talk about the inner Christ and the inner Herod as two equal forces, if you want to say, or realities. That essentially what history shows to be true is what turns out to be true within us as well. That despite the fact that Herod attempts to thwart the birth of Christ in the world, he fails in that. And as history progresses, Christ or Jesus becomes Lord of history, and Herod, but for the gospel, all but disappears from history. In other words, that as Revelations, the book of Revelation tells us, evil ultimately has no history, right? There is no history for evil. It is diminished or transformed or overcome, depending on how you want to think of that. I think, though, that what Christianity does well, even if that's often misunderstood, is it acknowledges exactly what you said. There are terrible things that happen in the world. What do we do with that if we are to fundamentally or primarily continue to affirm that we are good to our core, good, right? Created good. God saw all of creation and saw that it was good. So how do you reconcile that affirmation, that fundamental goodness of humanity, with the fact that when you read the front page of any newspaper, it's just horrific, right? On any given day. So that is what actually the church ultimately calls original sin, which unfortunately is profoundly misunderstood by many modern Christians as meaning that we are originally sinful. Original sin does not mean that. It is directly in opposition to our original goodness and insists that sin or evil is a second moment to humanity, is not fundamental to who we are, but yet is there and has to be dealt with over against this affirmation of our eternal goodness. And that's what we're grappling with here. And so what we, I think, need to be looking at as people who are intent on trying to better ourselves, right? Trying to live a rich, deep spiritual life. We have to ask, what role do I play in all of this? Where am I at in all of this? How does my inertia or complacency or lack of action contribute to this larger complex picture in which people are exploited, terrible things happen, people who shouldn't remain in power, and so forth and so on. And this is, it's difficult to look at because you have to acknowledge to some degree we're all complicit. But this is where I think, based on all the things I've even heard here today, where the beauty of it is that part of what I'll suggest within the spiritual life is that perfection is born in us, the way a seed grows into a plant without you making it happen, right? You provide the right environment and the flower grows. So the question is, what is the right environment? And for us, the language we use for that is Christ, and that is the life of Christ growing within us. And as Eckhart would say, the real fundamental component of the spiritual life is not to do, but to simply get out of the way so Christ can do in me. And the way he puts that is spirituality is more about subtraction than addition, more about removing obstacles that prevent me from being who I already am, rather than doing one more thing on a list of things I'm trying to do to prove myself worthy before God. And that is that dynamic process of asceticism by which I actively try to become passive before the grace of God within me. It is a striving to become passive, which sounds, of course, very paradoxical, but we have to work at that because we want to control. We think we know better. We want to exert ourselves. We want to prove ourselves and all of that. But what we learn in the ascetical life is to really allow our passivity to be a conduit, the way a piano is passive before the master pianist, or the flute before the master flautist. The instrument just has to let go. When I was little, we had a very old upright player piano with these little paper things that you'd hook in, and they would have holes, and there was a vacuum. You had to pump your feet at the bottom of the piano, and that thing would create a vacuum. And as the holes in the paper kind of came out, it would push the interior, it would push the key. So what you eventually had was this paper roll, and as those holes appeared, the keys would press, and you would have this amazing song, and all you had to do is keep pumping your feet. And I remember at one point trying to play with that. So I was pumping my feet and trying to sort of play on top of it because I was taking piano lessons, and it was an absolute disaster because I couldn't keep up with what the music was doing, and I didn't know the keys well enough. And that to me feels in my own life the way much of my spiritual life is lived out. The idea is to let the piano play, right? And stop trying to play on top of that, because you're just going to mess it up. You've got to step back and just let the magic happen. And the spiritual life is really about learning to do that on many levels. And that means starting with saying, where is that subtle voice of Herod saying, oh, when you meet the Christ, let me know where he is so that I too can go pay homage. This is what he says to the Magi. And what do the Magi do in response under the guidance of divine insight? They go home by another route. In other words, they ignore him. And that is what we have to learn to do, to ignore the voice of Herod. That's all we have to do. We don't have to fight. We don't have to try to assassinate him. We don't have to run him off the throne. We simply have to go home by a different route that ignores that subtle voice. And that makes all the difference in the world. So that's the striving. That's what we're striving to do, to find another route home that avoids that voice in us, right? And I think a lot can be accomplished with that simple act in itself. So Marianne, it's not going to necessarily solve the problem of evil for you, but hopefully by step, we take movements toward that, toward how we can become at least less complicit. So thank you for your comments and welcome once again. So, okay, we're roughly at 8:20 after or so. Thanks, folks. I'm glad you liked the player piano image. It was always a disaster. What we typically do for the second portion is, for those of you who are new, each week I give a practice that sort of attempts to connect with the teachings of that week. And what I'd like to do now is to offer what that practice suggestion would be for the coming week. And then we spend some time looking at what might have come up for us as we've attempted to engage the practice for those of you who have in the previous week. So let me call up the screen again. I do want to share. And by the way, for those of you who are new, Joanne has an email list in which this information is resent to you. If you'd like, maybe Joanne, you can put your email address, if you would, in the box. If any of you are new and want to be put on that list, what I'm about to show you now would be sent to you after the fact, so you don't have to worry about jotting all this down. All right. So we come then to, so here's the practice, before we move into our discussion, here's the practice I'm offering, or some version of this, for the coming week. So despite the atrocities of Herod, as told to us in Matthew's gospel, the interior Herod is most often subtle and cunning. In other words, not so outright terrifying within our own lives as something as bad as infanticide. The inner Herod rather makes his presence felt in subtle suggestions. And here's, building on the comment I was just making. He says to the Magi, go and find out all about the child. And when you found him, let me know so that I too may go and pay him homage. This is from Matthew 2:8. So this is the way Herod works, right? With these subtle suggestions. And so the invitation here is to attend to that whisper within you, the hints, the suggestions, the impulses, those little resistances that collectively diminish your spiritual vibrancy, that keep you in a sense lukewarm in your practice, in your discipleship, in your commitment to Christ or the gospel. And I'm going to try to correct this on the fly. And I'm going to say, do what the Magi did, ignore them. So practice with that. This is just a way of very gently, in the practice you already do. Notice, for example, and this is true of myself, maybe this harkens back to Richard's acknowledgement, as much as I teach and am so committed to my own contemplative life, after what is now probably over 30 years of committing to this, there is not like one day that I don't feel the resistance to move into meditation. And I just cannot seem to get to a point where I look forward to it. It's always like, okay, brace, sort of like working out. You just feel like, I just don't want to do this. After it's over, you're glad. And certainly once I move into it, it's like that hump is surpassed and I can move into something much deeper. But I notice there's still that resistance. That is one of the ways I find Herod working in me, giving me every possible reason in this moment on this day not to spend those 20, 30 minutes in practice. So that's my own candid admission of something I grapple with even after all this time. So that's a subtle hint or suggestion. It doesn't appear as some big emboldened voice. It's just a resistance, just a subtle inertia, just a lack of motivation. But it's enough over the course of the years to actually stop me. And now I've recognized, I say, that's you again. And what do? I simply ignore it. I don't battle with it. I don't justify it. I don't dialogue with it. I simply ignore the feeling. And that's kind of what I'm asking you to look at. How in your own life, on any level, do these subtle impulses or lack thereof hold you back, keep you lukewarm, prevent you from diving in? Just notice them without judgment. What do they have to teach you? What is that voice telling you? To use what someone said earlier, what is the love beneath that's seeking, right, to be addressed? So take a look at that and attend to that. For last week's practice, which I'm happy to open a discussion now if there are folks who'd like to do so or share what you've come up with. It was I asked you to journal. I don't know that I've ever given a practice for journaling before, but I thought it might be, I know some folks really find journaling a central aspect of their spiritual life. So I invited you to journal a bit about your own, what we called in the last week, theohistory. In other words, God's action conceived in your life, how the things in your life can be looked upon beneath the surface as some kind of providential movement, right, of the action of God in your life. So journal about your own theohistory, in which you tell a story of your own life in which you are able to discern the presence of God as it unfolded, or perhaps in hindsight. So did it ever happen where you had an experience and it thought, what is this all about? Why am I enduring this? Why am I going through this? And then in hindsight, you look back and say, aha, now I see it. And I thought maybe if you could spend some time journaling, it might bear some insights in how God has worked or been present to you. So with that in mind, I open the floor. Anyone want to share about that? Thank you, Luke, for your comment. It gives me great encouragement. But that's wonderful. It's all good. Mary Sue, please. Good to see you again.
There we go. And I'll turn my screen on too. Yeah, I do have a story to share, and it's one that I've shared before. It comes from a long time ago. But I think for me, it was one of those first times that I was really aware of God working in my life in an unusual way or an unexpected way. When I was in my mid-30s, so half a lifetime ago, My husband had a grand mal seizure while he was driving our car on vacation with 4 kids in the car.
Oh my God.
And it was obviously a terrifying experience. And I can remember being able to kind of grab the steering wheel, put on the brake, pull the car off to the side of the road. And we were in the middle of nowhere, Indiana, coming back from my parents' house. And when I look back at the things that happened that day and how this all unfolded, somebody actually stopped to help as I was waving my arms, walking down the highway. And when this person stopped, they were an EMT. And he only stopped because he saw the kids trailing behind me on the median. The next person who stopped was a nurse. The hospital we ended up, he was transferred to, was run by the Daughters of Charity. I was from a Vincentian parish, and so the connection was so real. And as this all unfolded, even in the trauma, I could see God's hand in it. The whole experience, and I'm not going to tell a long story, but what happened in this, he was diagnosed with a brain tumor that was terminal, but not metastatic, and went through radiation. And in the course of this whole thing, after radiation, it really, they couldn't find the tumor, although it did reoccur later. But I remembered also the experience of knowing what the Paschal Mystery is. I had walked through horrible fire trauma. I mean, it was a 5 or 6 month period that was just that totally, it pulled the rug out from under my feet, what I thought my life would be like. And yet I also remember the joy and the incredible disbelief almost when after they did the scan after radiation and said, we don't see anything, that this was like resurrection. Mm-hmm. And of course, in the years to come, I would go through that death and resurrection many, many times. And he eventually did pass away after about 10 years of battling this illness. But that will always stay in my mind as a piece of really understanding and living what this Paschal Mystery was. And it has held me through an awful lot of trauma that has, taken place in my life subsequently too. So really grateful for that ability to see and understand. And I have to say too, thank you so much for this session. It's really been a powerful one. So thank you to everybody who's shared.
Thank you, Mary Sue. I really appreciate that story. It is almost crazy in the middle of nowhere, Indiana, just like for the first 2 people to pull over to be an EMT and a nurse. I mean, that really is profoundly amazing. And indeed, I think that a lot of these concepts, which in a book can and are beautiful to explore, the Paschal Mystery, its implications, it's when it becomes embodied in our own life and experience that it just gets into our blood and bones. You say, now I see this whole a universe writ large with this pattern of dying and rising, dying and rising, dying and rising. And, although 10 years after this event, he succumbed to the tumor, what I think the pattern in the meantime opens to us is that death always leads to resurrection. That succumbing to the tumor really points to a greater opening or resurrection beyond that. And that decade of struggling, right, with that up and down, almost just becomes one more of those cycles. And you say, oh, I get it. It's not over until there's resurrection. And if there's not resurrection, it's not over. And so there's just that beautiful cycle that we experience, and that really speaks so beautifully to that. So thank you for that story. Really powerful.
Thank you.
Of course. Other stories or anything you journaled about that you'd like to share this morning? Carmen, Roman, thank you for your comment there. That's a lovely citation. By the way, we have a little mole in our garden here, and I saw the other day his little hands digging, and I thought there's absolutely no way that I could bring any harm to this mole. So we're trying to cope with him being there. He had these cute little hands, his little face that comes out. It's like, everyone's like, yeah, you got to put a mole trap. I can't do it. So far, the garden's hanging in there. So we're trying to find a way to humanely remove him. But so there you have, he's not a demon. He's a problem, but he's not a demon. We're trying to come to peace with him and figure out how he can live his life without destroying the garden. Robert, please.
Time I ever heard God speak very clearly to me was on this occasion when I was really angry with God. I was saying, why is it that my family is so unforgiving? And I was really tearing into God. And such a gentle voice came back to me asking, well, how forgiving are you? And it started a transition that continues, that perhaps I am well advised not to try and change 7 or 8 billion people, but just one.
And that's the work of a lifetime, Robert. Thank you for sharing that. Years ago, I spent time at a hermitage in New Jersey called the Hermits of Bethlehem, a lovely, beautiful space of monks and nuns living together in hermitage throughout a wooded area. If any of you are proximate to New Jersey, I'd recommend a visit. It's a lovely space for a retreat. And I remember waking up one morning in my little hermitage, which was on the edge of the woods, looking out to a field, and it was barely daylight. Just beginning to dawn, and I could see what I counted were 14 deer outside my window, just sort of doing what they do and grazing and being so peaceful. And this became just such a beautiful meditation around just looking at their beauty and the different ages and sizes and who had horns and who didn't. And I had a similar thought, how I became so aware of my own contradictions and my own limitations and my own hypocrisies, that the question came up to me, how in a world of 8 billion people does anything get done if there's 8 billion people like me? And what I realized was that is grace. That's the beauty of it. And what I witnessed out of my hermitage that morning was such a grace-filled, peaceful moment where grace clearly abounded despite 8 billion people just like me. And that was a real insight to me about the way in which grace operates, the way in which God shows up, if you want to say, or self-communicates to the world in such beauty, despite the mess that I am, and that I know so many people feel that they are. So it was a similar experience to your own that really became an awakening for me. So thank you for sharing that. Beautiful. So other thoughts before we close for the day? I don't want to cut anyone off or prolong it if people have shared what's on their heart. Mary, and then Sylvia, please.
Thank you for so much for this sharing. I was going back to the fight, flight, freeze syndrome. And some of you may have heard this story, but my son-in-law had a stroke at a very young age, about 5 years ago. And I was called in to be part of his healing team. I was put into situations that terrified me, absolutely terrified me. And but I would say that I spent 3 years looking at his eyes and being present to the human being that I knew was in there, and sort of everything else was periphery. And I was given the gift of understanding transformation and healing, and something that went beyond my own understanding. So it made me come back to our sharing today about if I am willing to face that which I ordinarily would flee from, I would get to see things in a much different way than what I understand standing from the outside. So that's what came to me.
Absolutely beautiful. That is such an insight into how we come to know. The phrase that comes to mind is walk in somebody else's shoes. Really know from the inside what that experience is, and how insightful that is, and what a beautiful experience of just being able to see into his eyes and hold that humanity that's there. It's beautiful, Mary. Yeah, and indeed, I think that's one of the things that you can, as I'm getting older, I'm realizing how little my college students really know. When I first started teaching, I was barely a decade older than them, and I almost could feel like I looked very young, actually was mistaken by some faculty as being students sometimes. And so had this real sense of like, I got them. And now I'm at a point where I'm thinking, God, they know nothing. They absolutely know nothing. And it isn't something that is really their fault. It's that life hasn't taught it yet. They haven't lived long enough to experience so many of these things where you begin to know from the inside out, something a book could never teach you. And thank you for that. Sylvia, please.
Well, I wrote in my journal about the night Lad died and you came, and two of my dearest friends, and the sheriff and the fire department and the coroner. And I was in such a state of shock, and then having all these, the sheriff and the fire department and the coroner all there, and you brought God to me in the form of love and service and kindness and honoring and blessing and being with and holding and embracing, and you created sanctuary in my greatest moment of shock and pain. And you came too when they came to pick Lad's body up. And so you, in your service and beauty, have been God showing up in human form. So I cannot thank you enough and honor you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sylvia. I appreciate that. I'm humbled by that. It was, an honor, and I know deeply painful. That was a tough time. And, to reflect something, Mary has shared, when my dad passed in November of 2019, and you were there for me in that beautiful extended conversation we had shortly in the days following, I really looked back almost with embarrassment as to how I was ever present to anyone in the time of grief, because I truly did not know the ravages of grief as I've come to realize it is. And, as Mary says, it's only when life teaches you this, it's just a different thing. Grief is something I just didn't know on that level, and didn't realize what it was and what it does to a person and how it plays out in your heart. And so in many ways, there was a full circle of my being there for you, because your presence for me during that time, when I was first just in a complete, state of just absolute darkness, to have that presence and then to learn from that now what it means to be present. I'm working with a gentleman who I've never met in person, only online, who I've been walking through his grief, the loss of a spouse. And again, she was very young, in her 60s. He's a very young man still. And I see things in his eyes that I recognize now that I would never have realized what was behind that. I just can see something that I just couldn't see before, even across something like this venue. So it's an honor to have been with you, but also to realize I think I was able to be with you in a way that 2 years ago, I don't know if I would have been able to have the same capacity to hold it in the way that I can now. And that's both the beauty of grief and the ravages of grief to teach us the depth of that. So thank you for that.
And I just want to say too, It is your lifelong devotion to God and to Christ that is allowing you to evermore embody Christ. It's not just it's your whole life, Father Vincent, bringing Christ through you into the world.
Well, thank you, Sylvia. Yeah, I appreciate it. I think that when I look at the faces of the folks here too, and what affirms me is how all of us are really, it's that falling and getting up, falling and getting up, falling and getting up. And to be able to do that with you all and to have that reflected and affirmed, and to have to see all of you really doing that very ungracious walk of stumbling, falling and getting up, stumbling and falling and getting up, is just such a hope for me and encouragement, because you don't hear stories like this in the news. You don't hear about people like you all in the news. We hear about all the terrible things, and yet here is the life of grace in our midst, and it's a beautiful thing, and helps me do, of course, what I do. So thank you for that. So, well, I know we're nearing time, and I don't want to belabor our time together, but really want to thank you all for your rich sharing. I'm actually much more hopeful about our slow move through chapter 4 than I was when we started today, because I really feel that what makes it rich and beautiful and transformational is exactly what so many of you have done here today, which is to move into it, to talk about what's deep within you, to talk about what's less than perfect within you, so that we can all embrace and love on you in the midst of that, and carry one another in that, and realize none of us have a high moral horse to ride in on, and that that spiritual intimacy is really born of that kind of deep authenticity that says, yeah, that's me too. Yeah, that's me too. That's, yeah, me also. So I'm just grateful for the depth and level and honesty of the sharing today. And Gerald, I see your hand came up. Why don't we give you the last word then today? Some of us don't even have a horse, exactly.
Thank you, Father. I hesitated to put my hand up after the very moving expressions that have been shared. But all I can share is I think God shows up maybe even in smaller, lighter ways in our lives. And we have 5 children, and it wasn't uncommon to take some of the kids with us when we went somewhere. And I was terrible about losing track of one of them now and then. And one time we had the kids, 3 of them, the 3 youngest ones, up at a place in Nashville called Opryland, which was kind of a small carnival, and they had in terms of the carnival rides, and they had a area especially for little kids. And so I let the kids get in line, and I couldn't see the 2 smaller ones, particularly the smallest one, but I could see the taller one. So I felt I was keeping track of them. Well, after about 5 minutes and the ride, I see the taller one come off, and then I see the next one, the young girl, but I don't see the tiniest one at all. And I looked around, and I'm surrounded with thousands of people with little kids, and I can't begin to explain the fear that developed in me. I guess it was fear. And I guess I just became blinded to everything except looking for that child. And all of a sudden I saw what looked like a policeman. I just went up and I grabbed him by the lapels, and I've lost my child. What do I do? There's just thousands of people around here. And he looked at me, and he just calmly said, "Sir, could this be her?" And he pointed to a lady standing right next to him with Anna in her hands eating an ice cream cone. And of course, I was overwhelmed and relieved that here was my kid in safe hands. And looking back, that had to be the presence of God in a way to bring that child back safely. I don't know where she went. I don't know what she did, where they found her. And I don't know, maybe 15, 20 minutes had passed. And what fear can do to you. I mean, I became so focused. I didn't even see this lady holding my child standing next to him. I didn't see it at all until he directed me to look right here. Thank you.
Gerald, I will keep this very brief, but hearing your story, we were, as a family down on the Jersey Shore, I have 3 sisters. My mother, we were all on the beach, very crowded beach, just like you described, thousands of people everywhere. My mother said, I'm going to go to the fruit market and get some fruit to bring back, stop by the inn we were staying in, and I'm taking the kids. I stayed back with my father. Well, in the course of this, 2 hours go by and my mother comes back. And only then do we realize my youngest sister, who was maybe 5 or 6 at the time, had been missing for 2 hours. My father thought she was with my mother, and my mother thought she had stayed behind with us. And so you can imagine that panic. And even as her brother, I felt I was just completely, is she in the water? Has she drowned? Has she been kidnapped? Is she wandering? Is she terrified? So we all kind of split up, and my parents ran back to the hotel and were asking management what to do. And they asked us kids to go to the lifeguards and start alerting them. So I see one of those really tall chairs where the lifeguards are way up there. I run over to the chair and I see a light color hair lifeguard and a dark color hair lifeguard. And for whatever reason, I talk to the light hair lifeguard and I'm like crying and I'm saying, my sister's been missing for 2 hours. My parents are running back to the hotel. Could you help her? Could you help us find her? And he just literally pointed and he says, is this her? And it was she was sitting right next to him. I did exactly what she did. I mistook her for a lifeguard. And I just completely broke down and I grabbed her hand and we ran back to the hotel because I'm thinking my parents are in whatever level of hell right now. And of course, everybody was reunited. But the idea of 2 hours having gone by where we all thought she was with somebody else just instilled this panic. It was horrific. So I feel your pain and how strange it was that we had such a similar encounter at the end of that. So graced moment, but not without taking a few years off of all of our lives, I think, from the panic of it. So thank you for that. So very good. Well, I just again want to thank you then all for your lovely and beautiful comments this morning. I'm looking forward to being here again with you next Saturday as we continue to explore this path, and would again encourage you to continue to look at those subtle suggestions within you and just to ignore them. Move on, acknowledge and ignore. Don't debate. That's when you're in trouble. Just ignore. So, okay, I look forward then to seeing you. In the meantime, I bid you, as always, Benum Christinet, go in the peace of Christ, and may you be blessed and healthy. May you be safe and may you be happy. May you go in the 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. And I look forward to seeing you again very soon. God bless you now.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Great. Thank you, Father Vincent. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne.
Bye.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you.